President-elect of the United States of America, Donald Trump.
Dilantik menjadi Presiden Amerika Serikat yang ke-45, Donald Trump dikenal sebagai sosok sensasional dan kontroversial. Sejumlah pidato serta kebijakan yang diputuskan dinilai memunculkan masalah, baik Amerika Serikat sendiri maupun dunia. Kebijakan dalam soal lingkungan, imigrasi, hingga proteksi perdagangan sudah diambil oleh Trump dan menciptakan kontroversi. Sejumlah kebijakan Amerika ini dirasa bersinggungan dengan sejumlah kebijakan serta kepentingan Indonesia. Apalagi, dalam setahun terakhir saja, Indonesia menjalin kerjasama senilai 10 miliar US dollar Amerika Serikat dengan negara paman Sam tersebut. Menurut data Badan Koordinasi Penanaman Modal, BKPM, realisasi investasi asal Amerika Serikat ke Indonesia mencapai 1,16 miliar US dollar Amerika Serikat sepanjang tahun 2016. Angka ini mengambil porsi 4% dari total penanaman modal asing yang masuk ke Indonesia. Salah satu kebijakan Trump yang kontroversial adalah soal imigrasi. Trump memperketat pengawasan bagi wisatawan dari sejumlah negara Muslim. Negara itu adalah Irak, Iran, Libya, Somalia, Suriah, serta Yaman. Padahal, Indonesia merupakan negara dengan populasi Muslim terpadat di dunia. Sikap proteksi Trump berlebihan lain adalah tembok di perbatasan Meksiko yang senilai 21,3 triliun rupiah. Menurut pakar hubungan internasional Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, Philip Vermonte, kebijakan imigrasi yang ketat ini tidak akan mengganggu hubungan kerjasama antara Amerika Serikat dengan Indonesia.
Dengan masalah di Timur Tengah, lalu di Korea Utara, dan lain-lain gitu ya. Sehingga secara radar geopolitik Amerika mungkin Indonesia tidak terlalu dilihat sebagai sesuatu yang betul-betul harus dijadikan preferensi utama. Karena mereka punya isu-isu yang lebih buat Amerika maksud saya. Isu-isu yang buat mereka jauh lebih penting soal Timur Tengah itu dan soal misalnya Korea Utara hari ini dan juga soal dia juga punya persoalan dengan misalnya Cina. Dan dalam konteks itu memang Indonesia negara yang besar di Asia Tenggara, tetapi kalau dia bikin priority list gitu ya, mungkin Indonesia tidak di yang paling atas gitu.
Dalam soal lingkungan, kebijakan Trump tidak kalah kontroversialnya. Donald Trump memutuskan untuk menarik Amerika Serikat dari perjanjian iklim Paris. Trump menilai perjanjian ini akan membawa sejumlah dampak negatif pada kedaulatan serta pertumbuhan ekonomi Amerika Serikat.
Therefore, in order to fulfill my solemn duty to protect America and its citizens, the United States will withdraw from the Paris Climate Accord Thank you.
Keputusan Trump ini mendapat kecaman dari sejumlah negara penandatangan Kesepakatan Paris. Perjanjian yang mengajak 192 negara untuk membatasi serta mengurangi emisi gas buang. Namun Philip menyatakan, kebijakan Amerika Serikat untuk meninggalkan Paris Agreement tidak berdampak secara signifikan dengan Indonesia.
Kalau buat Indonesia, saya nggak tahu detailnya, tetapi mungkin justru karena climate change itu kan mengatur pengurangan emisi karbon, lalu dia menerapkan standar yang sama. Jadi misalnya kalau dalam industri, kalau Anda memproduksi mobil, itu harus memenuhi standar bahwa karbon yang keluar dari knalpot misalnya itu harus sekian. Gitu. Kalau tidak ada aturan itu, berarti standar pembuatan mobil jadi lebih rileks. Gitu. Dan saya tidak mau bilang itu menguntungkan, gitu, tetapi bahwa ketika aturannya menjadi lebih rileks, ada peluang-peluang untuk mendapatkan keuntungan dengan mengorbankan lingkungan, gitu loh. Jadi lebih ke sana menurut saya dampaknya gitu.
Tidak sampai di situ, dalam program kerja 100 harinya sebagai orang nomor 1 di negeri Paman Sam, Trump mencabut Amerika Serikat dari Perjanjian Dagang Kemitraan Trans-Pasifik atau TPP. Trump beralasan tidak ingin bergantung secara bisnis dengan aliansinya. Ia ketakutan barang dalam negerinya akan kalah dari barang impor. Namun, sebagian sikap Trump juga dinilai hanya kata-kata semata tanpa ada realisasinya.
Presiden Trump nantinya mendapatkan tekanan untuk mewujudkan kebijakan. Kalau itu terjadi, menurut saya yang akan rugi bukan cuma negara-negara yang berhubungan ekonomi dengan Amerika, tetapi Amerikanya sendiri juga akan mengalami kerugian gitu. Karena apa? Karena dunia hari ini itu sudah sangat terkoneksi dan Amerika adalah juga bagian dari perekonomian dunia yang saling tergantung satu sama lain. Karena itu mungkin ada beberapa industri yang memang di Amerika sudah tidak kompetitif, gitu. Dia kalah dengan kompetisi di negara lain. Gitu. Misalnya untuk apparel atau industri manufaktur baju dan lain-lain itu sementara itu adalah industri-industri padat karya yang membutuhkan tenaga kerja yang banyak dan lain-lain gitu. Retorika Trump itu kan mau mengembalikan industri ke Amerika agar lapangan kerja terbuka gitu.
Bagi Philip Monte, kehangatan hubungan kerjasama antara Indonesia dan Amerika Serikat berpotensi tambah langgeng. Apalagi Presiden Joko Widodo dan Presiden Donald Trump sudah bertemu saat konferensi G20 di Jerman beberapa waktu lalu.
Saya kira fakta bahwa Indonesia adalah anggota G20 itu artinya masuk dalam 20 ekonomi terbesar dunia gitu. Yang karena itu dia bisa menjadi tujuan investasi, bisa menjadi tujuan untuk pemasaran juga gitu. Dari sisi Indonesia berarti elemen apa yang membuat Indonesia ekonominya besar gitu. Karena sebagai tentu market besar gitu, tapi juga kita punya mungkin comparative advantage yang tidak dimiliki oleh Amerika gitu. Mungkin salah satunya ekspor Indonesia yang paling besar itu ke Amerika kan ya kayak industri pakaian, sepatu dan lain-lain gitu yang saling komplementer dengan apa yang Amerika butuhkan.
Sebagai negara dengan ekonomi terbesar di dunia dan kekuatan militer yang kuat, langkah Amerika akan berdampak pada dunia. Itulah sebabnya Indonesia memperhatikan semua langkah dan kebijakan Trump. Nora Spasia, Jakarta.
Ya, pada bulan April lalu, Wakil Presiden Amerika Serikat Mike Pence mengadakan kunjungan ke Indonesia dan diharapkan hasil kunjungan ini untuk meningkatkan hubungan bilateral antara Amerika Serikat dan juga tentu saja Indonesia. Nah, sebenarnya bagaimana ya hubungan antara kedua country ini, apalagi mengingat bahwa Amerika Serikat sekarang di bawah administrasi baru banyak sekali ya mungkin pandangan-pandangan dan juga kebijakan yang berbeda dengan presiden sebelumnya. Belum lagi situasi global saat ini yang tentu saja bisa berpengaruh terhadap kedua negara itu. Nah, untuk membahas lebih lanjut mengenai hubungan bilateral antara Indonesia dan Amerika Serikat dan juga untuk lebih memahami sebenarnya apa sih kebijakan yang ada di Amerika Serikat di bawah Presiden Donald Trump. Hadir bersama saya Dubes atau Duta Besar Amerika Serikat untuk Indonesia, Joseph Donovan. Hello, Ambassador Donovan. It's good to have you here.
It's great to see you again, Desi. Thanks for having me.
How are you settling in? You've been here for a few months now in Indonesia. You've got a taste of the country, and how is it coming
I've been
forward?
here just a little over 6 months now, and I'm still learning a lot about Indonesia, but I'm having a great time, and I've been able to do some traveling and get out and see people outside of Jakarta, and that's a very rewarding part of my job.
That's great. And of course, the United States since last November had a new administration, and we had a visit from the Vice President, Mike Pence, back in April. So what are your main priorities now?
Well, first let me say that I think Vice President Pence's visit was a real milestone in our relations with Indonesia. And that's because he did several things. One, with President Jokowi and with Vice President Kala, he reaffirmed our very strong commitment to a strategic partnership with Indonesia. He also visited the Istiqlal Mosque and met with interfaith leaders to demonstrate our respect for religious freedom here in Indonesia, particularly for Islam. He had very good discussions with American and Indonesian business leaders and talked about ways that we could increase our trade and investment ties with Indonesia. And finally, he went over to the ASEAN Secretariat, and he announced that President Trump would be coming out for the 3 leadership meetings, the East Asia Summit, the ASEAN or ARF Summit, and APEC at the end of the year, demonstrating our strong commitment. So his visit really set things in a very positive mode. Since then, we followed up with a number of very key and important visits. Foreign Minister Matsudi has been to the United States and met again with Vice President Pence and with Secretary Tillerson. Defense Minister Ramazard met with Secretary Mattis at Shangri-La. Ministers Susi and Luhut have had very, very good meetings in Washington, as has Minister of Finance, Sri Mulyani, with our Secretary of the Treasury. So there, you can see we've been very, very busy. Right now in Washington, we're holding our trade and investment forum agreements, which I hope will result in real concrete progress on ways that we can move forward on trade and investment.
Okay, tell me a little bit more about the concrete follow-up, because also, I mean, this obviously will be sort of part of your focus while you're here in Indonesia. And during the visit of Vice President Pence, of course, you know, there's a desire to have more trade, more investment, and yet at the same time we know that, especially under President Donald Trump, the focus is more on the US, for example. And I mean, how will that translate to increasing trade and investment here with Indonesia, especially given that there is this more sort of inward-looking and protectionist attitude from the US when it comes to trade?
This is the way that I would look at it, that the Vice President's visit created some opportunities to move forward on addressing some areas that we're concerned about that impede the expansion of trade. And the Trade and Investment Forum is a great opportunity to look at some of those issues. Some of those issues would include things, restrictions on local content, or requiring local content for investments, or data localization and areas like that. These are areas that I think if we work together, we can create real opportunities for U.S. firms. I might add that people often ask me, they say, what am I going to do to increase American investment in Indonesia? And I would put it the other way around. My responsibilities are to give American companies good advice so that they can make good business decisions as to whether to come here or not. I also work with the Indonesian government to explain where we think that there are barriers or impediments to trade. So it's up to the Indonesian government to create a positive environment where American companies believe it is in their interest to come here.
How is the business climate these days? I mean, how do we rate in the US eyes, especially since we've got you know, the Freeport problem until now has not been resolved. How do you rate Jokowi's?
I've just come back from a 2-week trip to the United States, and I visited several cities in the United States and met with many American companies. And I think that they're all very interested in President Jokowi's commitment to moving ahead with economic reforms. And I think that that is a very positive sign, and they're very interested in that. They've expressed concerns about issues like the requirements for local content that I've mentioned and data localization, and also asked me what steps that Indonesia is going to be taking to achieve greater coherence and consistency in their regulations. And I think this is an area where the more that President Jokowi does, the more you're going to find American businesses interested. I might also add that there are a number of areas that we think that there are particular opportunities for American firms, and that includes in the aviation, not just aircraft, but aviation across the board, also in power generation, and possibly also in solid waste management, which I know these are major priorities of President
Yeah, that's fair enough, because we often have that kind of feedback from foreign companies because business climate and regulations, red tape in Indonesia, we're not one of the most efficient countries, especially compared to our neighbors. But how about other forms of relationship? Obviously, Indonesian, we've seen a lot of exchange students, for example, educational opportunities and so on, and US AID and how is that coming along and going in the years ahead, given that perhaps the US government is much more focusing on other areas that are more prioritized than, for example, expenditure on those kinds of...
Well, a very good question. Right now we're continuing those programs and we're pushing ahead, and I think with to great effect. You mentioned USAID. We have a number of programs on health, sanitation, water, good governance, issues like that. We also have our Millennium Challenge, and those programs are roughly about 100.
But is funding not affected for them,
right now,
especially for the Millennium Challenge?
Right now, the funding for our USAID programs are going ahead, and that's about $100 million a year. For the Millennium Challenge account, which is a different program, we're moving ahead. The funds, roughly a little bit more than $100 million a year. Those funds are committed to three areas. Again, priorities. And by the way, the Millennium Challenge account was a program which we fund, but it was designed by Indonesians for Indonesians. The compact that we have with Indonesia is scheduled to end next year. That has always been the case. It will end successfully. There are three areas that we have worked together on. One is on helping to improve government procurement. Another is community-based nutrition, which is aimed to help overcome the problem of childhood stunting, which affects about 37% of children in Indonesia. And another part of this is to look at new technologies, green technologies that will also help Indonesia. The important thing about the MCC Compact is that it was designed for a limited amount of time, and the compact will end successfully next year. So that shouldn't be seen as anything other than the successful conclusion of a program that way.
How about educational exchanges, scholarships, Fulbright? I mean, are these being impacted by the new sort of focus of the Trump administration?
They have not yet been impacted. We're moving ahead. I can't predict the future. This will be something that will depend on the interaction of both our administration and our Congress, and they'll be working forward on that. I can say that one of my highest priorities is trying to increase the number of Indonesian students studying in the United States. That number is roughly about 9,000. I would like to see that increase tremendously. We do a number of things to help Indonesian students make good decisions as to where to go and study. We've had education fairs this year already in Surabaya and in Medan and here in Jakarta. I speak regularly to student groups. We have educational advisors throughout. And you mentioned Fulbright, AID, and a number of other scholarship programs.
So you actually want to increase the number of students, but isn't it, with the visa regulation, the extra checks and so on and so forth, do you feel that in your effort that you're not actually being helped? I mean, you're sort of hampered by these sort of new concerns and new restrictions, and it's actually,
No, I don't. Obviously, we are always looking at ways to make sure that we are protecting American citizens and that we're doing the appropriate vetting. And we're doing that not only here in Jakarta in Indonesia, but we're doing it worldwide. And we'll continue to do that, as any nation does, to protect its borders and its security. But if, for instance, today, that you wish to make an appointment as a student to have a student visa interview, that appointment could happen within 2 or 3 work days. Roughly, our statistics now indicate that about 90% of Indonesian students who apply with the proper documents, including an acceptance letter from a U.S. college or university, 90% of them will be accepted. It will take about 2 to 3 days after your interview to process that. So I don't see that as impacting, but at the same time, obviously, we will take prudent measures to vet all these applicants to ensure our safety and security.
But the travel ban in Indonesia being the world's largest Muslim country, do you think this will have some, raise concerns of anxiety, particularly among Indonesian students? Maybe they might change the application from, to the US to other parts of the world.
If I could make 2 points on that. The first is that the executive orders on immigration did not affect any Indonesian citizens. Those executive orders were about protecting the safety and security at our borders, which is the responsibility of any nation. There were over 40 Muslim majority nations, including Indonesia, that were not on that list. And of course, in accordance with our legal procedures and our democracy, the courts have at least temporarily stayed those executive orders. The larger question, though, I think, and one that I'm asked very, very often from prospective parents or prospective students is, I'm a Muslim, my child is a Muslim, will he or she be safe if they go to the United States to study it? And here's the answer that I have for that. If everybody who goes to the United States to study will have a unique experience. If they study hard, they're going to get a world-class education. They'll learn a lot about themselves. They'll learn a lot about the strengths and the weaknesses of the United States. And they'll help Americans understand a lot about Indonesia. And the last part for me is also very, very important. In talking to many students, both at the high school level, at the graduate school level, the undergraduate, who have come back to Indonesia, one of the things that they say, and they're very proud of, and I am too, that they really help Americans understand about Indonesia.
What about concerns that, I mean, we read it a lot in the news, is increasing sort of intolerance and discrimination, particularly towards Muslims. Is this a concern, a valid concern for an Indonesian Muslim who studies or who goes to the United States and, you know, wearing the hijab and so on? Will they feel the sort of
when I was
unsafe these days?
When I was on this trip, I met with students in places like Chicago, Indonesian students in places like Chicago and in San Francisco, and I asked them that. And I think that their experiences have been overwhelmingly positive. Now again, every student's experience will be unique. I've also asked some students to be specific about their experiences. If you can, let me tell you one story that to me is very, very moving. There was a young woman who was going to a high school in the United States, I think in the northern part of the United States. And she told me that she woke up one morning and that she learned that there had been one of these terrible shooting incidents, terrorist incidents in the United States where people had died. And she said she initially was afraid to go into school that day. But she finally mustered up her courage and she went in, and she said as she walked into the school, her friends came and they started to hug her. And they said, we know this is not about you. This is about terrible people who have done terrible things.
Yeah, there's always, you know, two sides of the story. Often in the media we sort of focus more on sort of the negatives, but having said that, so is there an increase in intolerance, particularly more sort of Islamophobia as a result of the new administration? I mean, on you know, subjective.
I believe
because this is real fear that.
I believe that the vast majority of Americans and the vast majority of Indonesians are a very tolerant people. I believe that it's important not to take this for granted. There have been voices in both of our societies that have spoke out against tolerance. And I believe it's important for leaders, religious leaders, government leaders, members of civic society in both of our societies to speak out in favor of tolerance, in favor of respect for other religions and other beliefs. And that's our responsibility in both of our societies.
This is also a concern for you when you see how Indonesia develops, because our democracy also means that a lot of other sort of voices are given a platform, and lately we have had examples of you know, very you know, polarized emotions, and particularly when it comes to things like the Jakarta election, for example. Is this kind of thing that worries you? I know you have been here in Indonesia for 6 months, but knowing what you've known about the history of Indonesia, is this a path that you see Indonesia is treading quite dangerously?
I'm still learning about Indonesia, and I shouldn't comment on the specifics of the case you mentioned, but I will say this. For Americans, freedom of religion and freedom of speech are intrinsic to us and our Constitution and our beliefs as a people. We believe that everyone should be free to speak out in favor, to speak freely, to practice their religion freely. We also believe that no one should take action, violent action, against another for their religious beliefs. But speaking out critically is different than taking action. And it's hard to see that as, from our perspective, as something that you would want to legally sanction. What I mean by this is, in general, the issue of blasphemy rules, not here only in Indonesia, but globally. We think that oftentimes that this can be conflated with restrictions on freedom of speech or freedom of religion. So we are not in favor of blasphemy rules in general. At the same time, I know that we certainly commend those religious, civic, and governmental leaders here in Indonesia that speak out in favor of tolerance and speak out in favor of support for diversity, and commend them as I hope in my own society people will do.
Let me ask you now something that Indonesia is very interested at. A couple of years ago, we signed the Paris Agreement in December, and Indonesia had been we've got very ambitious target. We want to achieve reduction of emission by 27% by 2020. And also Indonesia was the one who sort of put together the Bali roadmap. And hoping that a lot of with international help and international funding, we could actually increase the reduction of our emission by much greater percentage. But now with President Trump obviously not too keen on continuing the Paris Agreement, do you see this as something that will be a problem in the future, particularly when Indonesia's efforts to curb its climate greenhouse gases emission?
As you stated, President Trump has announced our decision to withdraw from the Paris Accords. And he did this because of his concern. He said that United States citizens should not be bound by commitments that were not also being applied to other large economies, the world's most largest economies, and that there were commitments that were that the United States had accepted on the Paris Accords that simply were not being applied to others, that they wouldn't have to even begin doing this for 15, 20 years out. And so this process of withdrawal will take several years to happen. He also announced, and Secretary Tillerson has reinforced this, that we intend to, certainly we are committed to working with our partners and our allies for a way forward on this. And we certainly are willing to do that and have future discussions as to how that plays out. We are now engaged in an internal process in looking at our policies on climate change. In the meantime, we're also committed to remaining as an environmentally conscious nation. In fact, our CO2 emissions, if you look back since 2005 to the present, our CO2 emissions have decreased by about 11.5%. So we're making great strides on this, and I expect that to continue. We are committed to a partnership with Indonesia on environmental issues, and I expect that to go forward. Again, the extent of that will depend on consultations between our administration and our Congress in terms of the exact funding. But right now, those programs are also continuing.
if there is a withdrawal from the Paris Agreement, it would not happen until 2020. If, for example, say President Trump is no longer elected, is this something that can be reversed by the administration after that, or is this?
I can't say. I don't have a crystal ball to predict these things. But the process of withdrawal from the Paris Accords will take several years in accordance with our obligations.
Because the funding element is very much important for countries like Indonesia, where we do without help of international funding, it's quite difficult for us to achieve our targets. And the other thing is the TPP withdrawal. I mean, how do you see? I mean, when we had President Obama, there was this sort of Asia pivot, and of course Indonesia sort of being sort of a very important and largest countries in ASEAN country. Everybody's quite excited to be part of a much greater sort of partnership. How do you see that in the future, particularly when we see China becoming a lot more aggressive and might be filling the hole where the US
I think the fundamentals remain the same. And by the fundamentals, what I mean is our belief that our prosperity and our security are intimately linked to the Asia-Pacific region. Now, I'm the US ambassador to Indonesia, so let me focus on our relations with Indonesia. We believe that a democratic, a prosperous, and a secure Indonesia is in our interest, and that it's in the interest of the region and the world.
You're being very diplomatic, which is understandable. Well, under President Obama, because he grew up in Indonesia, there was sort of like an emotional tie, but not much when it comes to actually implementing in terms of increasing trade and so on and so forth. And actually, when President Trump was elected, I hear, some Indonesian businessmen said, oh, maybe this is the sort of, President Trump is a businessman, he knows, he makes deals, and maybe he will actually create more sort of job opportunities. I mean, how do you see is there a change in the sort of relationship between the US and Indonesia now? How important is Indonesia, especially since Donald Trump has investments here? He has, hotels and properties, and there are talks of him expanding.
Well, you mentioned TPP. It's important to remember that Indonesia was never in at the ground floor of TPP. So whether or not TPP was going forward or not, at this point we would always be talking about what we could do bilaterally to increase trade and investment. I think that part is very important. And that's really where I'm trying to put my energies and my attention. I mentioned aviation, power generation. All of these are areas that President Jokowi has identified as among his top priorities. And we think that American companies can offer the best technology and just have an awful lot to offer in these areas. And these are areas that we're exploring our trade and investment relationships with. It is important to remember that in the last 4 years or so, that our exports to Indonesia have declined by about 30%. And that's not from a lack of trying. That American companies that I talk to are very interested, but sometimes they find it very difficult here to do business. So part of what I'm doing, in addition to advising American companies and helping them to make good business decisions, is also to work with the Indonesian government to identify areas where we think that there are problems or challenges to doing business here, and find ways that we can work through that. It's important to remember that American companies, international companies, have options. They can decide to invest and do business here, or they can decide to invest and do business elsewhere, places like Vietnam or Malaysia.
And some of them have.
And some of them have. I would certainly like to help the Indonesian government to create an environment where they could come here and prosper. And for a business, one of the things that they will always look at is whether or not they can earn a fair return on their investment. And I don't think that people of Indonesia should see this as a bad thing. In fact, it's a good thing. That if a company believes that the business environment here is conducive to making a fair return on their investment, and that there is good, clear government regulations and they're consistent and coherent, then they'll come here.
Yeah, and this is the homework for the Indonesian government, and this is also the request of the domestic, investors and people who do business here. And it's a problem that the government, I think the Jokowi government has been trying by producing sort of these reform packages.
Yeah, I think,
but obviously it still hasn't worked that well.
But I think they're working very hard at it.
Yeah.
And I commend them for that.
Let me ask you now, because this is something that we're trying to get our head wrapped around, and also I'm trying to understand, and you are representing the United States. What exactly is a foreign policy that the current administration, is there a clear foreign policy that the administration has that we can really understand, particularly the last visit, for example, of President Trump to the Middle East, and Indonesia is very much interested in the Middle East, obviously because we have a Hajj, the pilgrimage, and also we send our workers there, and now this diplomatic rift between the Gulf countries and Qatar. What is actually happening there, and what can we learn from the governments, U.S. governments?
Desi, I spend most of my time just thinking about U.S.-Indonesia relations, but let me take a little bit of a crack at this. I think with regard to the Middle East, and beyond as well, both Indonesia and the United States have been victims of very terrible terrorist attacks. And so we have a common interest in fighting global terrorism and global violent extremists. And that's very important. I think we have an interest also in prohibiting, combating the financing of foreign terrorists, and also to working against those that would support in other ways violent extremists. That's very, very important. With regard to Qatar, certainly we believe that the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, should play a leading role in resolving the issues that have emerged there in the last couple of days. And this is something that I know President Trump and Secretary Tillerson and the Indonesian government too. And certainly we would commend the Indonesian government's efforts in this area as well.
I think the Indonesian government would like to sort of play a part in creating peace in that region. But how do you see this is? How do you see sort of the end game of it all? I mean, I know we're speculating, but because one of the things that we've seen from President Trump's visit to the Middle East is sort of, Iran is our common enemy, but now we see, Iran helping Qatar, and we also see Turkey helping Qatar, and then, this whole thing is suddenly very messy, and how...
You're right, it's a very complex issue that involves far more than my expertise on following our relations and promoting our relations with Indonesia, and I really hesitate to offer an opinion on that.
But is there a clear direction that, or the mandate that you as the U.S. ambassador to Indonesia have, that this is, this is what the relationship should be, or this is what we want to get out of Indonesia? Do you have a clear sense of direction?
Yeah, my mandate is to work hard to strengthen our strategic partnership with Indonesia, to support Indonesia as it plays a very important and often leading role within ASEAN and ASEAN centrality, to engage in discussions on a wide variety of international issues with our Indonesian counterparts, and that includes the Middle East. As difficult and as sensitive and important as that issue is, it also includes North Korea and issues like that as well. Includes the South China Sea issues also.
You regarding the South China Sea, how do you see that? Because Indonesia, we, well, although we're not sort of part of the, we're not party to the conflict with China, but Indonesia is seen as a good sort of referee in this dispute. How do you see the US's involvement?
We have a number of very important interests on this issue. Among the first is the freedom of navigation, to be able to operate in this region according to international law. We have an interest in the peaceful resolution of the issue of outstanding claims of sovereignty. We believe we have an interest in making sure that no one party can use force, intimidation, or coercion, that instead that uses established diplomatic law and practice, but particularly diplomatic law, and I'm referring to UNCLOS, to resolve these issues. We don't take a position on the sovereignty issue ourselves, but we believe that the nations involved should use peaceful methods to do this. And we certainly have a great respect for the process within ASEAN designed to conclude a code of conduct for operations in the South China Sea, and fully support that. And as you said, Indonesia has a very important role to play in that context.
Is moving closer towards China not something that you're worried about when it comes to, like I said, you know, this sort of less of an interest in this part of the world? Do you see that? Because I see, you know, Japan and South Korea is getting quite worried about the US's sort of lack of interest in this part of the world.
You know, I really beg to differ. I think, again, that there is still a very strong U.S. interest in this part of the world, in our relations with Indonesia. And as I said, it's because of our vital interests that are at stake here. We believe that a democratic, a prosperous, and a secure Indonesia is in our interest. We are active here in a number of different areas of our USAID programs, our counterterrorism programs, support for law enforcement efforts here, a wide range of things that we continue, encouraging more Indonesian students to visit, to study in the United States. All of these things, I believe, are good for the United States. I hope they're good for Indonesia, but that's obviously for Indonesians to decide.
Finally, Ambassador Donovan, tell us something about the US. I mean, what is happening there? I mean, what sort of country is it now, and how do you see it sort of evolving as society, and with, because you know, at the moment social media basically takes over our perception of everything and anything around us, and what comes out from social media is often maybe true, maybe not. You know, we talk about, you know, fake news and so on and so forth, but what can we learn, what can we what we need to understand about what is happening in the US at the moment?
I think, like Indonesia, you'll find that the great majority of Americans are a very tolerant people. They support freedom of speech, freedom of religion. They are very concerned about global terrorism, as are many people around the world. They're committed to fighting that. There's always an element of concern on that, and that's still there. But overall, the Americans that I know, the America that I care about and believe in, the fundamentals of that have not changed. And this is a people who are very proud of our democracy. We are willing to help people around the world. You know, with regard to, just for a little bit on the side, with regard to refugees, we are still we are the major contributor to refugees around the world in terms of financial contributions. We are still one of the leading nations in taking refugees. We obviously, there's concern about protecting our borders and making sure that terrorists stay out, and we'll take the steps necessary to do that. But you're still going to find that America is a very open country and a very open society.
Do you think that America is still great, or does it still need work to make it great again?
I believe that I should not rest on my laurels for the sacrifices that my parents made to make America great, and nor should my children. I think that this is a process, and that we should always be aspiring to do even better.
You enjoying your job here in Indonesia?
I'm having a great time. I really enjoy it. People here have been very, very kind and very open to me.
Is it a hard job or an easy job, especially compared to your past experiences? Because I know you're quite familiar with this part of the world.
You know, it's a great job. I worked very hard to get this job. I hope I work very hard every day. I remind myself that it's a real honor to be able to represent the American government, President Trump, and the American people here, and that I need to earn that every day here.
That you've made lots of friends, I'm sure.
People have been very, very kind to me, and I certainly think of them as friends.
How's your
yes.
bahasa?
It's belum.
Harus belajar.
Yeah.
Masa Donovan, thank you for speaking with us. It's been a great pleasure,
Sure.
and well, I hope we can, come up with more sort of concrete proof that a bilateral relationship between Indonesia and the US can grow much stronger for both our countries' benefits. Thank you very much.
All right, thanks a lot.
Thank you. Ya, demikian insight kali ini bersama Duta Besar Amerika Serikat untuk Indonesia, Joseph Donovan. Jangan lupa saksikan insight besok bersama saya Desi Anwar. Sampai jumpa.